As Trey stood outside the towering iron gates of the luxurious estate, he felt a pang of hesitation. He knew this neighborhood all too well. The pristine lawns, the gleaming cars, and the cold stares that often met him whenever he passed through. People like him weren't exactly welcomed here. But as he looked down at the frightened golden retriever in his arms, he knew he couldn't walk away. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the ornate doorbell and waited. Moments later, the grand oak doors swung open, revealing an older woman dressed in an elegant silk robe. Her sharp blue eyes scanned Trey suspiciously before settling on the dog in his arms. "Bailey," she gasped, her expression shifting from skepticism to relief as she reached out for the trembling pup. Trey carefully handed the dog over, watching as the woman's demeanor softened while she cradled the animal. "Where did you find him?" she asked, her voice carrying a mix of curiosity and concern. "In the alley by the community center," Trey replied politely. "He looked scared and hungry, so I thought I'd bring him back." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied Trey. For a moment he wondered if she would accuse him of something. Stealing perhaps, or trespassing where he didn't belong. But then to his surprise she offered a small, grateful smile. "You did the right thing, young man. I've been looking for him all day." Relieved, Trey nodded. "I'm glad he's safe now," he said, adjusting his worn backpack. "I should get going." "Wait," she called out before he could turn away. "What's your name?" "Trey, ma'am." "Well, Trey," she said, stepping back inside and returning with a crisp $20 bill. "Take this as a thank you for your kindness." Trey glanced at the money but shook his head. "Thank you, ma'am. But I don't need a reward. I just wanted to make sure he got home safe." The woman's brow lifted in surprise, clearly not used to such selflessness. She looked at Trey thoughtfully for a moment before saying, "Tell me something, Trey. What do you do after school?" "Help my mom, do a few jobs around the neighborhood, and sometimes go to the community center," he answered honestly. She nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "Well, I might have something better than money to offer you." Trey's eyes widened slightly in curiosity. "What do you mean?" The woman smiled. "Why don't you come by tomorrow? I think there's something I can do to thank you properly." As Trey walked away, his mind raced with curiosity. He had come expecting nothing, but it seemed this small act of kindness might lead to something he never expected. As Trey walked away from the towering mansion, his heart felt heavier with each step. He had done the right thing, but Mrs. Kensington's cold accusation echoed in his mind. He knew the look she gave him all too well. The judgment, the suspicion, the assumption that someone like him couldn't possibly be doing something good without an ulterior motive. He sighed, shoving his hands deep into his pockets as he trudged back toward his side of town. The weight of rejection pressed on his chest, but he reminded himself why he had returned the dog in the first place. Not for a reward, not for recognition, but because it was simply the right thing to do. Later that evening, as Trey sat at the dinner table with his mother, she noticed his quiet demeanor. "You okay, baby?" she asked, placing a warm hand on his. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah. I just thought people would be more grateful when you do something good." His mother, a woman who had seen her fair share of life's injustices, gave him a knowing smile. "Not everyone will see your kindness, Trey. But you don't do good for them. You do it for you." He nodded, but the encounter still gnawed at him. The next day, Trey returned to his routine: school, helping his mom, and running errands around the neighborhood. But he couldn't shake the feeling of disappointment. He found himself wondering what life was like for people like Mrs. Kensington, people who lived in big houses with fancy cars and still looked at others with distrust. Did they ever stop to think about how their words could hurt? Meanwhile, inside the grand Kensington mansion, Mrs. Kensington sat with Bailey curled up beside her. Despite herself, she couldn't stop thinking about the boy at her doorstep. His eyes, full of honesty and sincerity, haunted her. She had spent years surrounded by people who only sought something from her: money, status, or favors. She had grown to expect ulterior motives from everyone, but something about Trey unsettled that belief. As she sipped her tea, her butler, Mr. Reynolds entered the room. "Ma'am, I couldn't help but notice. That young man seemed quite genuine," he said gently. "Perhaps you were a bit..." Mrs. Kensington frowned, tapping her perfectly manicured fingers on the porcelain cup. "I suppose," she admitted quietly. "But you can never be too careful these days." Mr. Reynolds nodded. "Perhaps. But kindness, ma'am, isn't something to be feared." Later that afternoon, an unfamiliar sense of guilt nagged at Mrs. Kensington. She found herself glancing out the window, half hoping to see the boy again. But he was gone. And in his place, a question lingered in her mind. Had she been wrong about him? Back in his small apartment, Trey sat by the window, looking out at the street lights flickering on. He knew he shouldn't let Mrs. Kensington's attitude get to him, but it was hard not to feel hurt. Still, he reminded himself of what his mother always said. You don't need anyone's approval to do the right thing. And with that, Trey resolved to keep being himself, kind, honest, and hopeful, no matter how the world treated him in return. Little did he know, his kindness had already begun to leave an imprint in the most unexpected place. Inside the grand foyer, Trey stood awkwardly, his eyes taking in the lavish chandeliers, gleaming marble floors, and ornate furniture that looked untouched. Mrs. Kensington, now visibly shaken, took the envelope from his hands and carefully counted the crisp bills inside. A deep sigh of relief escaped her lips, and for the first time, there was something other than suspicion in her gaze. There was gratitude. Lily, still standing nearby, looked up at Trey with wide eyes. That was the money Grandma was going to donate to the community shelter, she said innocently. She thought it was lost forever. Trey's eyebrows raised in surprise. "It was in Max's collar the whole time?" he asked, scratching his head. "Guess he was hiding a secret." Mrs. Kensington gave a small, reluctant chuckle, a sound Trey hadn't expected to hear from the stern woman. She glanced down at the envelope again and then back at Trey. "You could have easily walked away with this," she said, her voice softer but still firm. Trey met her gaze without hesitation. "I was just doing the right thing, Mom. I wouldn't want someone to think I'd take something that isn't mine." Mrs. Kensington's lips pressed together in a thin line, and something shifted in her expression. The boy standing before her was not what she had assumed him to be. Slowly, she nodded and gestured toward the plush sitting area. "Why don't you stay for a bit?" she offered, surprising both herself and Trey. Lily clapped her hands in delight. Yes, we can have cookies," she said excitedly, running off toward the kitchen. Trey hesitated. A part of him wanted to leave and put this entire experience behind him, but something about the way Mrs. Kensington was looking at him, almost as if she were seeing him for the first time, made him stay. "All right," he said cautiously, sitting on the edge of the expensive-looking couch. Mrs. Kensington took a deep breath, studying him carefully. "Trey, was it?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She sat across from him, tapping her perfectly manicured nails on the armrest. "Where you live?" "Over on the east side," Trey replied, his voice steady. "Near the community center." Mrs. Kensington's expression faltered for a moment. "That's quite a ways from here." Trey shrugged. "I walk a lot. Helps me think." Lily returned moments later with a tray of cookies and milk, grinning as she placed them in front of Trey. "Grandma doesn't let me eat too many of these, but today's special," she whispered, winking. Trey chuckled, taking a cookie and biting into it. It was surprisingly good. As he chewed, Mrs. Kensington watched him thoughtfully, seemingly lost in thought. "You remind me of someone," she said suddenly. "My husband. He always believed in doing the right thing, no matter how people treated him." Her voice softened as she continued. "You did the right thing today, and I misjudged you." Trey glanced at her, surprised by her honesty. "It's okay," he said after a moment. "Not everyone takes the time to see who people really are." There was a long pause before Mrs. Kensington reached into the envelope, pulling out a few bills. She held them out to Trey, but he shook his head. I didn't do it for money, ma'am, he said gently. She smiled, retracting the offer. I can see that. She glanced at Lily, who was beaming at Trey as if he were a hero. But maybe I can offer you something better than money. Trey raised an eyebrow. Like what? Mrs. Kensington leaned forward, a thoughtful look in her eyes. How would you like to work here? Part-time after school. I could use an honest young man like you, and Lily could use a friend. Trey blinked, taken aback by the unexpected offer. Work here? Doing what? Mrs. Kensington's smile widened. Helping around the house, maybe teaching Lily a few things. She could learn a lot from someone with your sense of responsibility. Trey hesitated. The idea of working in such a grand place felt intimidating, but there was something genuine in Mrs. Kensington's voice now, something different from before. He glanced at Lily, who looked hopeful. Before he could respond, Lily chimed in eagerly, bouncing on the edge of the couch. Please say yes, Trey. You're really cool, and Max loves you. I think we could be great friends. Trey hesitated, feeling a strange sense of belonging he hadn't expected to find here. I'll have to talk to my mom first, he said thoughtfully. Mrs. Kensington nodded. Of course. And Trey, this job isn't charity. It's an opportunity. I see potential in you, and I'd like to help you make the most of it. Later that evening, Trey sat at the kitchen table, recounting the entire encounter to his mother. She listened, pride shining in her eyes, as she reached across to squeeze his hand. Trey, you've always had a good heart, she said softly. This is a chance for you to show them just how special you are. Encouraged by her words, Trey returned to the mansion the next day and accepted Mrs. Kensington's offer. Over the following weeks, he grew into his new role, handling responsibilities with dedication and proving himself beyond what anyone had expected. He walked Max, helped around the house, and even shared ideas with Mrs. Kensington on how to make small improvements in the mansion's upkeep. The once cold house began to feel a little warmer with Trey's presence, and Mrs. Kensington too found herself changing. She no longer saw Trey as just a boy from the other side of town, but as a hardworking young man with dreams and a bright future. Trey's life had taken an unexpected turn, and he realized that sometimes rewards weren't just about money. They were about opportunities that could change everything. Months passed, and Trey's life blossomed in ways he had never imagined. Working for the Kensingtons provided more than just a paycheck. It gave him a glimpse into a world he had always seen from a distance, but never thought he could belong to. With every task he completed and every conversation he shared with Mrs. Kensington, he learned valuable life skills, time management, organization, and even a touch of business acumen as he helped manage household affairs. At first, it felt surreal to be surrounded by luxury, but Trey remained grounded, never forgetting where he came from. He continued helping his mother at home, balancing his work and studies with unwavering dedication. What once seemed like a temporary job had turned into a pivotal chapter in his life. Mrs. Kensington, once cold and distant, began to see Trey in a different light. His work ethic, integrity, and warmth gradually chipped away at her old prejudices. She found herself enjoying his presence, relying on him for more than just chores. She sought his opinions, valued his perspective, and even trusted him with things she wouldn't have imagined months ago. One evening, as they sat in the garden with Max lazily lying at their feet, Mrs. Kensington spoke candidly for the first time. Trey, I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life, she said, gazing into the distance. But you've taught me more than I ever expected. You have something special. Trey, surprised, smiled humbly. Thank you, ma'am. I just try to do my best. Mrs. Kensington shook her head. No, it's more than that. You have potential, Trey, and I want to help you achieve it. She paused before adding, if you're serious about college, I'd like to contribute toward your education. Consider it an investment in a future I believe in. Trey's heart skipped a beat. He had been saving every penny, but college had always seemed like a distant dream. Now, here was an opportunity that could change everything. I don't know what to say, he stammered. overwhelmed by her generosity. "Say you'll make the most of it," Mrs. Kensington said with a rare, genuine smile. By the time Trey graduated high school, he had secured a spot in a prestigious college, something he had once only dreamed of. He was no longer just the boy who returned the lost dog. He had become an extended part of the Kensington household, someone they respected, admired, and genuinely cared for. Even Lily considered him a big brother, and Mrs. Kensington, with quiet pride, introduced him to her circle as a young man with a bright future. The transformation wasn't just in Trey's life, it spread through the community. At a special event organized at the community center, Mrs. Kensington took the stage to share Trey's story. With the crowd listening intently, she spoke of his honesty, resilience, and the life-changing impact of a single act of kindness. "Sometimes," she said, her voice full of emotion, "we are so quick to judge others that we forget to see their true worth. Trey reminded me that kindness is not about where you come from. It's about who you are." When Trey was invited to speak, he stood at the podium looking out at the familiar faces, his mother, his neighbors, and even his former doubters. With a deep breath, he said, "Doing the right thing doesn't need a reward, but sometimes it changes your life in ways you never expected." The room erupted in applause, and Trey smiled, his heart full of gratitude. He realized then that his journey was just beginning, and with the support of those who believed in him, there was no limit to what he could achieve. As he walked off the stage, his mother hugged him tightly, tears of pride in her eyes. "You did good, Trey," she whispered. "So good." And as he looked around at the people who once doubted him but now celebrated his success, Trey knew that he had not only changed his own life, he had inspired change in the hearts of others as well.